So hi, Tanya. Nice to see you. We first met about 3 weeks ago at ICP for the press opening for the new exhibit, Actual Size. You remember that?
Of course I do. Of course I remember.
Yes.
We had such a nice conversation.
Yes, we did. And I also caught Vince Aletti lurking in the shadows. Did he come and chat with you?
We had a little talk. Yeah, he said he liked my key.
Your key.
Yes, he was taken with this key that I wear around my neck.
Oh, okay. He wrote about your work in the New Yorker. Yes, so you know
a while ago.
Yeah, so you know one another from before.
Yes, he's written about my work actually for a number of years. About I think he wrote about another show as well. But I think if you're there's a little piece that he wrote about my show Fallen that was at Julie Saul Gallery, and Vince is great. I mean, he's so perceptive, and he's a beautiful writer.
Yes,
so I have great great respect for Vince.
So listen, we'll be talking about your work, of course, but first, tell us how you became a photographer. You entered Bard College, where you teach now, quite young, at the age of 16, I think. And then you took a photography class by chance. How did that all happen?
Oh, yeah. So going back, 1981, I was, 16 and living in the suburbs outside of New York City. But it wasn't a good stretch for our family and for me. It was just a very difficult time. And so I felt like
chaos, you call it.
Yes, chaos. Yes, I wrote you some notes. It was chaos. Yes, it was chaos. And it was, it's quite interesting because I was even talking to my students about this the other day, about like this idea that the life of the artist is this like very tumultuous, unstable thing. And I know for me, as my life has become more stable, of course, there's lots of instability in the world, needless to say, I feel like it's only furthers the work, right? That the external chaos or the chaos in my life at that period, that was not conducive to productivity at all. Anyway, I was determined to get out of the situation and sort of find a better path.
Continuity and stability.
Sorry, what?
Were you looking for continuity and stability? No,
not at that time. Certainly not. All I knew was that I needed to be somewhere else. So I would have gone to military school, boarding school,
anywhere.
Just moving out was an option as well. I think I had run away a couple of times, although nobody really noticed, so it didn't count as running away if nobody realizes that you're gone. I'm being a little melodramatic, but anyway, so I found a little brochure for Bard College at Simon's Rock, where I wouldn't have to do any more high school. I could just start college right away, and I was with my friend Josh Cowan, who also ended up going. So I went to Simon's Rock, which is part of Bard. It's in Western Massachusetts. It's specifically an early college. And honestly, it was absolutely life-changing because I had been a very poor student in high school. I wasn't attending very much. And it was sort of unclear whether I was going to be able to kind of recapture any sense of discipline or curiosity.
What was life-changing about it?
I just re-engaged. I re-engaged with work. I mean, I remember just reading material for my classes, very small classes. And if I didn't do the work, there was really nowhere to hide. And it was actually quite strict. Like I had this teacher who I'm still friends with all these years, Jamie Hutchinson. And, you know, if your paper was late one day, it was, you know, 1 letter grade off. So if your paper was 3 days late, you would get a C or a D if it was an A. So there's no, you don't do that too many times, right? So I learned by a kind of combination of being held accountable to others and sort of holding myself to account. But the real change happened in the second semester when, as you said, I was planning to take a drawing class. I had been interested in art my whole life. And I had been taking drawing classes at the Art Students League. But the class was full and I didn't get in. So I sort of, in a very disappointed way, took photography instead. And I would say within weeks, I was complete. I mean, it sounds really hyperbolic, but it really did completely change my life. It totally changed my life.
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, as an art, photography is very particular. It's a different kind of art form. And you can fall under its magic if you're exposed to it. I'm not saying that for all artists, but for us who are photographers, it certainly has a, you know, an attraction of a particular kind. So that's what happened to you, I guess.
It is what happened to me. And I really credit, I feel like it was the key ingredient, at least for me, because I was so self-absorbed. And so this thing where the lens is just pointing out, right? I am within myself and I'm looking, but I'm looking outward. And then even just the mechanics of learning to just understand f-stops and shutter speeds and how to make a good exposure. And the fact that there was a sort of distance between the thing I was making with the thing I was making. So like if you're drawing, you know, here I am and have my piece of paper and, you know, it's just, there it is, right? There's just no intermediary.
Yes.
And I think that was another piece of it that was tremendously compelling to me, that there was this mechanical tool that seemed kind of cold, like a kind of cold descriptive device.
An instrument, yeah.
An instrument, but that you could infuse it with meaning, with subjectivity, with purpose, with point of view, with so
that aspect of it fascinated you?
Yeah, so I mean, it was just a kind of a very natural evolution where I was interested in it. I felt like maybe I was a little bit good at it. And so I just put in more and more and more hours. And then it was sort of like that natural discipline when you are just driven from within. It's kind of carried over to all of the other aspects of my life, except maybe one. But that took a while. I would, you know, just like the romance department,
yes,
that was
yes,
that took a long time to evolve, but it did. So I felt like the kind of natural discipline that I developed and just that I felt in photography, you know, carried over to my classwork, my writing papers, just all my work habits. I just became a lot more disciplined.
Watched over everything. But tell me, how long was it before your love and your interest in 17th century Dutch masters pulled you away and you went to Oberlin College? How long was that?
Well, that interest developed.
How did that happen? You were so engrossed into photography. So how did that happen?
Oh, so yeah, just to clarify that transition, I transferred so at Simon's Rock, I got my associate's degree.
Yeah.
After 2 years. They had a BA program back then, but it was very small, sometimes fewer than 10 students would stay for their BA. I knew I was interested in art history. but also, you know, I think I may have already known that I would be a photographer, but I don't know if that was really conscious exactly. So I transferred from Simon's Rock to Oberlin, where I majored in art history and studio art. And that it was actually at Oberlin that I became interested in 17th century Dutch art.
But what were you doing there in studio art? Were you actually drawing and painting?
Yeah, I did everything. I mean, I took painting, printmaking, drawing, sculpture, and photography. So I was doing kind of photography within the context of all these other practices. And I guess I still felt that there was no question for me that photography was absolutely central. I wasn't sure whether the other practices would kind of continue on or not, or whether it was more like a kind of exposure to different kinds of ways of working, which I think was very important.
So later on, you win a fellowship to spend a year living in the rainforest with the Bari of South America. You know, there are Bari in Sudan as well. They're not the same people.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was absolutely kind of unbelievable experience. At the time, I actually thought I might be interested in reportage, you know, just more of a kind of somewhat more journalistic direction. I was a TA for Gilles Perez, who now teaches at Bard, the brilliant Gilles Perez. And
you're very lucky.
Yeah, and actually my work, it was 2 weeks or something, but my work with him, and just seeing his work, right? The book Telex Iran, this extraordinarily groundbreaking book that I think suggested a completely different sensibility and possibility about what photojournalism or reportage even is. And I found that really compelling. So I applied to this, you know, I got this Watson Fellowship, which funds a year of independent travel, a project of your own making. So I went to the Venezuelan rainforest I didn't go completely by myself. I was with my boyfriend, Ian Bennett, who was studying anthropology. And it was actually entirely through him and work that he was doing with his professor, Steve Beckerman, who had been working with the Bari for 30 years. So I was trying to come with them on their research trip. That was sort of the how it all began. This all gets a little long-winded. I hope it's not boring. But anyway, so it turned out they did not get their National Science Foundation grant. So there was this question of like, what would we do? Would it even be possible for Ian and I to go on our own without this anthropologist? Anyway, we went. We lived in a little tiny village of 27 people called Someme, which means butterfly because there's butterflies all over the Barakai River. No running water, electricity.
You learn a bit of the language?
I did. Very, very difficult language. It's a tonal language. The little kids learn Spanish because they go to the mission school, which was very sad in so many ways to see what the kind of terrible cultural destruction from the presence of the missionaries. That's a very complicated story though, yeah.
And you eventually made it to Yale for your MFA.
After the year in the rainforest, which was pretty incredible, it was very hard to transition out of that.
Imagine. Re-entry must have been difficult.
What's that?
Re-entry must have been difficult.
It was. We tried to live in New York City, and after 2 weeks, we had to leave. We couldn't do it. We moved back to Western Massachusetts, and I worked as a waitress, and but I had my dark room. I was making work all the time. And then I thought at that point that graduate school seemed like kind of a natural step. Yeah.
So how was it for you to be there?
It was
a change in tone and in environment from previous institutions?
I mean, yes, because I had been at very small schools. I mean, Oberlin is bigger than Simon's Rock, but I was in a small program within a really big university.
Yes.
And I had been accepted to various art schools, but it was very clear to me that one of the reasons why I wanted to go to Yale, apart from like the program, the photography program, was the fact that it was within the university, which seemed like an incredibly rich place. And I think that's something that's been a through line for me, like even just studio art and art history at Oberlin, where I was also taking philosophy courses and psychology courses and literature courses and studying Kafka or studying, like, it's always been something where doing my work within the context of something bigger, where I'm also like really riffing off of things that I'm learning about, and sometimes in very, very direct ways. So that was one of the best parts about being in the graduate program there. I took photography history with Alan Trachtenberg and American documentary film. Maybe it wasn't American documentary film with Michael Romer. I studied feminist theory with Laura Wexler, and that was actually another sort of, I would say, like a touch point that was really important. Laura and I are still very much in dialogue all these years. And there was also something pretty incredible about studying feminist theory while being in the Yale program, which was, I mean, to say it was like patriarchal or male dominated is like putting it mildly.
Stating the obvious.
Stating the obvious. That being said, I didn't feel that, like, the women students, I didn't feel like we were exactly treated differently. You know, I think we were taken very, very seriously as artists, but there was just the weight of the tradition in a way that was extremely narrow.
Yeah, systematic, it's part of the system. So going back to your work, I remember you standing in front of your piece, which was very impressive at 13 feet, I think, by 5. That's what it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite impressive. And it's called Woven number 30, the one piece at ICP right now. And I remember being very taken by it because it was such a beautiful shot. It was also so beautifully printed. And you and I started talking. And this image belongs to a group called The Woven in your 3-volume book. And the other 2 groups are Fruitless, which is about trees, and Fallen, which is about decaying fruit. So tell us a little bit about the arc of the triptych, the triptych covers. There's also an essay by a dear friend of yours, but tell us about the triptych and what it all means, and then we'll get back to other stuff.
Yeah, no, great question. And thanks for the nice comments about the piece at ICP, really. So the Fruitless, Fallen, Woven began in 2005. And I had actually been working on a different project overseas called Wax Bodies. I was photographing anatomical models in museums in Florence and Vienna. But back home, I was photographing trees. And this came as a bit of a shock to me. I don't know for you as a practitioner, where sometimes you're drawn to something that you feel like you shouldn't be drawn to. And for me, I've been working.
I'm wasting my time, but
yeah. So I had been working on subjects having to do with the body and the archive, and but I had been living in the Hudson Valley since 1991, and I was actually at that time teaching at Simon's Rock, back where I started, and I would drive through Dutchess County, Columbia County, past these incredible orchards. And there was this one tree, which is actually fruitless #1. It's the first in the series, that would it was like miraculous, where it would hold its fruit through the winter. Like it was like this image of these white snow-covered orchards with these sort of burgundy fruit still on the tree.
That would be very striking.
Yeah, it was really moving to me. So I started photographing the apple trees with my 4x5 view camera, primarily in black and white, but occasionally in color. And this lasted for 5 years. So I often returned to the same tree in different seasons. Some of the trees died during the time that I photographed them. Trees would be unrecognizably transformed in spring and then turn into the bare bones sort of skeleton in winter. So the seasons, the power of, I don't know, the presence of these trees. I had a very kind of particular thing I was looking for that had to do with, usually the trees are in the center of the frame, not always, but usually. I'm usually down on my knees. I'm kind of looking up and out. So, they're in the middle of a pretty crowded orchard. So finding that sort of sweet spot of being able to kind of isolate and describe a single tree was very much at the heart of that series. I will say that during this, it was evolving that my mother clearly had dementia. And this was sort of my way of wrestling with that, these like cycles of loss, and it was just part of it. And, into Fallen, there was this amazing moment when I was photographing Fruitless, where I'm usually looking up and out, where I suddenly start looking down at the ground. And there before me is like a Dutch 17th century still life, right? A vanitas still life of fruit in different stages of decay.
If we only look.
Yes, if we look. So it was just like this, again, a kind of epiphany of a shift in perspective. And so I began photographing the fallen fruit beneath the trees with my view camera in black and white. And then I had another epiphany, which was the transition from Fruitless into Fallen, when I started to work in color in the photographing the apples. And there was something where it immediately had this very different kind of affect, clearly much more allegorical. And I had already, of course, you can't photograph a tree without thinking about the Garden of Eden and the tree of knowledge and the tree of good and evil. So all of this was always, was really, really on my mind. And I've been always my interest in Genesis and the whole, like that piece of
biblical aspect of.
Yes. Yeah. So then, so I guess one of the points that I'm making, you can see I'm a little long-winded about these things, is that it's not as if in 2005, I thought I'm going to make a 3-part series over the next 15 years. One thing kind of evolved into the next. Fruitless into Fallen, with the shift to color, the shift to losing the horizon line. There's not a single horizon line in all of Fallen or Woven. And the work becoming more constructed.
The color palette is really wonderful. It's so subtle.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think also my methods began to change. Again, out of a sense of problem solving. I would go out to photograph, and I really like this kind of soft, bright, but low contrast light. And sometimes I'd be out in an orchard for 8 hours freezing, you know, waiting for a cloud to go by. So one day I just collected a whole bunch of apples, and I brought them home, and I put them all around my yard to make little scenes to photograph there, you know, when the light was good. The deer ate them all the apples. So I did this again, but I put them in my freezer this time. And I took them out to make a little arrangement. And there was this absolutely beautiful frost that lasted on the apples, looked a little like mold or like sugar.
Fuzz,
and
a little fuzz.
A little fuzz. It was like just beautiful. And it also would sort of shade the apples, right? Like certain areas that were warmer.
Yep.
So it had this very interesting effect on the volume of the apple. So that sustained me for 5 years, this interest in composing these scenes out in the landscape, sometimes in my yard, sometimes in swamps, sometimes in gardens, where I would bring things, snakes, bats, fruit in different stages of decay, and kind of construct these tableaux out in the landscape. Then into Fallen, I had this impulse. There's actually a piece behind me on the wall here. That's Fallen number 496. It's the largest of the Fallen pieces, but it was pivotal in the move to woven, because I thought, what if I want to capture the peripheral vision of the viewer even more? And as these works have progressed, I've thought more and more about the viewer and the experience of the viewer, and scale, the scale of the photographic object, the scale within the piece. So woven, I moved away from the 4:5 aspect ratio. I moved to the 1:2 aspect ratio, and they get the tableau become more and more elaborate and constructed. Instead of working on the ground, I designed a wooden frame that I work upon and compose, you know, on that. But I'll pause there, because I feel like I have more to say about that, but I don't want to go on and on about it.
So you brought the work home, so to speak, and you built these frames. And when we spoke at ICP, you told me about how you intervene into the subject with a torch, burning a leaf or a twig here and there to get the color darker or more burnt looking. And you must have 1,000 tricks that you use on the material before you photograph it. Tell us a little bit about your work process, how you set up your pictures in your backyard, and where exactly do you shoot? Do you have several of those set up simultaneously? Do you photograph, do you have several cameras, several setups that you photograph simultaneously, or just one at a time? And what do you do to them as time goes by? Because this is organic matter, it moves, changes.
Yes, exactly. It changes. That's exactly right. It changes by its own process, and then also the things that I'm doing to it, because I am a total pyromaniac too. But that's a little bit of another subject. But yeah, so I have this wooden frame. It's kind of like a garden bed that's tilted up at a 45-degree angle. It's made of plywood, and then I screw onto it like pieces of bark and things like that, so that it's terraced, filled with dirt, garden soil. So I use that frame, and it's kind of great that it's called a frame, because it's kind of like it works as my frame. It literally becomes an analog to the photographic frame. And then I add things, right, to it. Bark, leaves, stones, mushrooms, all sorts of things. Usually when I make a piece, and I only make one at a time because they're like, I have only one of these frames, but they're really intense and involved. And I don't think I could possibly
I thought you
handle
had several of them waiting for this one to cook while you're photographing that one.
too much. And I actually don't have the physical space for it. My frame is actually 5 by, it's longer than what I use. And it's all of this takes place in underneath a tent, like a 20 by 18 tent with a white.
A translucent tent?
It's not like a greenhouse. It's translucent. Yes, it's translucent. So it's white translucent canopy, which makes this just gorgeous, even, beautiful light. Yeah. And then when I photograph, I'm up on a scaffold. But you were asking about the things that I do. Like, so when I make a piece, it can involve, sometimes I'll plant seeds in the frame. I'll transplant things from the forest, from my garden into the frame. The foundational composition actually often takes me longer than any other part. Like, even if it's not that visible later, it's there, like the infrastructure of that composition. And then sometimes I can get really into the minutia. Like, there's one piece called Woven number 27, where mostly the concept had to do with metamorphosis. And I've raised over the years, I've gone out looking for little monarch eggs with my son and things like that, and watched them hatch. And so I was determined to have live chrysalids in the piece. So the whole thing was orchestrated around the timing of collecting monarch eggs, raising them, having them like form chrysalids, and then having some caterpillars that have hatched. Now, this is in some ways madness, because we're talking about a thing which is 5 by.
Yeah. Also, you cannot control a lot of these events.
Yeah. Well, but it worked. It worked. So, but this is all to get a little element in the piece, which is like barely an inch, right? It's barely an inch, but it somehow, it felt key to the piece. In that piece, I also, like, oftentimes I'll push myself and just see, like, what am I physically sort of visually able to do? And in that piece, I actually pushed the angle of the frame back a bit. I had a different frame back then, and sort of sculpted into the frame these sort of rock, dirt, mushroom formations that I could fill with water, so that there would be sort of little pools of water in this kind of swampy environment. Over the years, I've developed better methods for doing that. Like, when I shot that piece, I filled the pools with real water, which drains out very quickly. I've since moved to using Elmer's clear glue, which makes something that looks just like water, but is thick. And so the methods are really, it's very like thrilling to be that connected to the natural world for me, to be sort of participating in it, and in some ways trying to control it to some extent, but really not being able to. Like, I feel like I'm sort of I'm subservient to the natural forces, but I'm kind of trying to harness them or participate in them. And sometimes I might be expediting these cycles. So like where I find that torching certain areas is a way that it makes it look like it's been there for a very long time. Even if it's not perceptible to the viewer that it's been burnt. It's like, it's sort of part of the expedites, like the natural decay process. Yeah. Like woven number 30, the little ribs are burnt. There's like lots of places where the deer ribs are
Yeah.
You
I
know.
have to say that when I looked at it, the thing, my overwhelming impression is that it felt very natural and organic. It did not look like it was orchestrated or premeditated or set up. And, but at the same time, it looked just perfect. And the sense of the dirt and the darkness and the texture was all there. Yeah, it was really quite striking. And I understand that some friends send you dead insects in the mail or other such creatures.
It never ends. Like just
They still
yesterday.
do?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just yesterday, a friend of mine who lives not far from me, we old friends who keeps bees, was cleaning out her hive. And, you know, there's some dead bees always. And she's like, do you want these? And I'm like, definitely. So I'll be getting, you know, several hundred dead bees. I'll paint them gold. I have plans for the bees.
So how does your family feel about all these dead things around the house?
Oh, the family has adapted. I mean, my you know, over the years, it's like they know what a really good gift is for me. Like I remember getting a huge, like old dried fungi for Mother's Day one year that, you know, the kids had found, or, you know, a petrified bat from an attic, right? They'll bring me, people bring me these things. Actually, at my show, a friend of mine brought me 2 birds he had kept frozen for several years during the pandemic. And he brought them to me at ICP.
3 weeks ago?
Yeah, well, it was on the Thursday, and I met him at the show, and he rode his bike across the bridge from Brooklyn and brought me these 2 beautiful birds in a little freezer chest that I brought back up to the Hudson Valley. I mean, it's very sad, but people find dead birds all the time.
Yes, of course.
And then they, you know, I'll memorialize them in some way.
You know, you photograph things that people rarely pay close attention to, really, but you focus on them. And in the process, you chronicle the imperceptible passage of time and the works of nature at play. And often, and I noticed that about the piece at ICP, that the particular piece ends up looking like a tapestry. And is there a connection between that and the trips you often took to the Met with your dad when you were a kid? Is there some kind of connection, voluntary or not? Is there a connection there?
I mean, I would just, I love your question. I mean, I love the way that you're thinking about this, but yeah, absolutely. Because not just looking at tapestries as a child, although certainly the unicorn tapestries at the cloisters, you know, they're kind of crucial to the woven series, right? They're really at the heart of, and this gets to that, back to your question about like, what was I studying at Oberlin? What was my experience at Yale? Because really engaging with, say, medieval tapestry, how they're working allegorically, how they're made, right? Like I think there's a really beautiful analogy between this stitch in a tapestry and a pixel. And so like, in a way, I think of the woven series as like, it's almost like you remove this idea of the dominant figure, right? Where there's the unicorn or there's the hunt for the unicorn or whatever it is. And instead the drama, and this gets to what you're talking about attention and particularity, the drama is not necessarily where we think it is. It's kind of in the background that requires us to attend and look, but that the drama of the life cycles that might be in just the tiniest leaf or stick within this bigger world is as poignant a drama as something that has like the dominant, like kind of a dominant narrative.
You're saying the substratum is everything.
Yes.
Really,
yes.
That's what it all emanates from.
Yes, exactly. And so the early trips to the Met with my dad, the Met actually has been so much, I don't even know how to describe it. I mean, it's kind of like just, I would go there I remember when it was really quiet, like when I was in my 20s, the Met was a really quiet place. And I'm glad so many people are going to the museum, I suppose, but there was something so magical. I would get lost often. It took me years to sort of figure out the lay of the land, but that was amazing to end up in a room where I might be looking at Persian miniatures, right? Instead of like, I'm on my way to a photography show, but I end up looking at Persian miniatures or ancient Greek figure sculpture or,
yes.
Right. So I think that's been, and it still is
you don't get to choose or decide. It just happens.
Exactly. Yeah.
So on a personal level, what does looking at an evolving subject over long periods of time bring to your process and to your own understanding of time as a force?
I'm sorry, the time, I missed a word.
What does looking at an evolving subject over time on a personal level bring to your process as an artist, but also to your own understanding of time as a force?
Oh, time as a force. Yeah, that's a great question, because I mean, I think photography at heart, right, is about fixing a moment, right? The moment, time is unfolding, even as we're speaking, right? We're recording this, but time is moving as we're speaking. And the photograph can freeze a moment in time, not unlike, the freezer. My freezer is also literally freezing a moment in the decay. It's either halting decay or growth. I'll sometimes refrigerate ferns to make sure they won't unfurl. So I think time in the natural world as a way of, because we are part of that world, right? We're not like outside the natural world. I'm, getting older. We've always been getting older from the moment we were born. It's not like all of a sudden you start getting older when you're 50, right? This is like, and we're all moving towards death, right? And it's always a presence. And that's just a part of the richness of our lives. And I think that's one of the reasons why the biblical narrative of Adam and Eve has been so important, because both fallen and woven, it's like I'm imagining the Garden of Eden after the fall. And in a sense, I think paradise before the fall didn't have time in the same way. But as soon as you have death, you have time. And the clock is ticking and the sand is going through the hourglass, right? So working on these projects is like a way of meditating on that, connecting with it, living it out in a way. It's like each piece I get to live out a certain cycle, and the creative process itself, right? I make this thing, I pour my heart and soul in it. I get completely insane when I'm working on a piece. I actually do, that I feel more sorry for my family for. Like, not so much I have my own, I believe me, I was long ago kicked out.
Absent, let's say.
Yeah, so I've been kicked out of the family freezer long ago, right? I have my own separate freezer. But when I'm working on one of these pieces, it takes me over totally. And so then when it's over,
So there's a beginning, a middle, and an end to the process.
Exactly.
But when we speak of loss and decay, which you've been addressing, are we also talking about the unrelenting process, an unrelenting process, a driving force in nature that does not end in death?
Well, is there, I mean, I hesitate to use the word miraculous, but I feel like my new project is so much about miracles. It's called Book of Miracles, that it's on my mind. In nature, and perhaps in everything, death isn't without life, and life isn't without death, right? They're a duality, which is really one thing.
Or a continuum.
Yeah, so I think in each piece, my aim is in some ways to create a wholeness between the two, right? That it's a cycle, but they're really one thing: growth and decay, growth and decay. You know, a tree falls, and then like the mycelium and fungi, right? It's like this whole thing, and then that's what makes new things grow. And our bodies are part of that, right? Our bodies are transient, but they will, depending on what we do with them when we die, become a part of that. So I guess I like to see the cycles of loss or decay or death, not as its own sort of separate, like sad thing at all, but just a force that's part of creation and destruction and life and death. I do want to say, though, that the work is also partly about things being out of balance in the natural world.
But who decides what the balance is?
Right. But I guess even just in making the pieces, like there was a piece I made, woven number 17, in February of 2017, I think it was. And I was imagining that it would be this like very wintry piece. And it was before I learned all about like how to make fake snow and ice and things like that. My methods got a little more, like, I don't know, elaborate, artificial, but it was warm, right? It was a warm February. It was like, things, because I'm out there in the forest all the time and I'm collecting things, I'm observing things that are growing that would never have grown when they're growing. And so my observations of those things, the way in which the work to some extent reflects what was actually growing during the time that I make a piece or not growing. I think that is also very much part of the, of the work. And certainly it's a really big part of the new project in a more upfront way.
So David Campany of Outrageous Books art directed your book. He's very good at conveying the central thought behind a novelist's work, which is his strength as an art director. How was it for you to work with him? How was it working with him?
Well, I think you put it beautifully. There's this incredible experience, other artists have talked about it too, where you go out to Santa Fe to design the book and you sit down with David. And it's like you do a kind of like Vulcan mind meld or something. I mean, David has this extremely like if he's going to work on a book, right, it seems like there's a way in which he has an understanding of the deep conceptual and expressive underpinnings of a project. And then in the best way, right, a book is an articulation, like an almost like architectural structure of the conceptual and visual underpinnings of a book, of a project, excuse me. So I think David's sensibility about that, I mean, he was amazing in designing this book with me. For example, you know how it's like this 3 volumes in a slipcase. And I remember thinking, you know, there's this sort of issue where with the book, it was a tricky thing to turn into a book, right? You have black and white, mainly vertical trees. Then you have color, all horizontal images, all horizontal,
and the aspect ratio is changing.
And then the aspect ratio changes, and there's all this intense detail, which could become like kind of visually overwhelming. So to work that out, like I always figured it would be a horizontal book. And he immediately had the impulse that it should be vertical, which was a huge thing, right? Like that right there. Then separating it into 3 volumes. Then I was thinking that the slipcase should be, he's like, well, what are your thoughts about the slipcase? And I was like, I'm thinking maybe dark gray, very simple, very plain. And he's like, why don't you go get a snack and come back in 20 minutes? So I leave and I come back and he's mocked up this thing, which I wish I had one sitting here, but it was completely amazing. So
I saw it.
Yeah, so each plane, front, back, bottom, top, side has uses a different image from a different project. And in a sense, pulls the entire thing together.
Like a mosaic.
Yeah, and it was, so I would say that it was absolutely just amazing to work with him. In the woven series, in the woven volume, we ended up using these tipped in plates so that the viewer is first confronted with just a white page. So it's like very quiet. And then you open it up, and that way it also avoided the woven pieces going into the gutter of the book. And then each of the woven pieces gets its own full page bleed of a detail. So it sort of mimics.
That was a great addition, the detail.
Exactly, because there's so much about, right? You look at them from afar, maybe they function more like a tapestry or an abex painting. And then you come in and you're back to the more of the Dutch still life world. And I think that design structure of the book helped to kind of mirror that experience.
Yeah, because also the size of the piece when it's shown allows both looking from a distance and also coming up close. So when you do a book about the work, you have to sort of replicate the experience of the viewer in a museum or gallery setting, which is what happened here in the book. Yeah, it was great.
Exactly, like you sort of have to mimic that and at the same time accept that what you're making is something totally new, right? Like the best books, I think, and I think that Radius Books really does this well, is that it recognizes that you're not in a museum standing in front of the thing. So how then within the new language of the book can it work? Can it work in the new language of the book?
He also has exquisite taste, I must say. His work is remarkable.
It is.
So tell us a little bit about Diane Arbus's picture, A Child Crying.
Oh, okay. And remind me, I wanted to say a little something more about time and the photograph, but I'll talk about Arbus because there was something I forgot to say that I think is important. Oh yeah, so I wrote about that picture for Photograph magazine a couple of years ago. when I guess I had my woven show up, and Photograph magazine asked me to write just a couple hundred words about, it could have been about one of my own images, or it could be about a picture that had an impact on me. And it took me no time at all to decide what I wanted to write about. And it was the photograph of a child crying, very tight photograph, of course, square, by Arbus, because I had seen that during that semester, that first semester of photography, studying photography in college, where, I would go to the library, and it was a very small library, but, the photography book shelf, case was maybe, 4 feet. So I would just look through all of them. And I remember pulling out, Edward Weston and Ansel Adams, and there was this sort of just something. Then I pulled out Diane Arbus, and I hadn't heard of her before, but it was like, where am I? What is this? It's not Edward Weston. It's not Ansel Adams, right? It's something so enigmatic, extraordinary, shocking.
Different, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, but that particular picture, I had been quite unhappy, right? So there was this picture of this child wailing that, of course, there was like a way in which I was like identifying with both Arbus and the kid, but also just marveling at what was possible in photography.
Yeah.
This like moving in so tight to this moment. It's like there's this shallow depth of field, and you just see a little hint of what's behind the child. And every little tiny thing participating in the meaning of the photograph, right? So you have the child's mouth is open, the tonality of the black inside the open mouth. Then there's like the glints in the eye, little like light that's captured in the dimensionality of the volume of the tears. Then there's like a little button at the top of the kid's sweater, which is like, looks like it's just like a little too tight. You want to like undo it. And it's this amazing antithesis to the outpouring of expression of the cry. And there's this some little formal, but your eye moves from the little glints of the tears to the glint of the button. So it's like extremely economical and restrained, but wildly expressive at the same time. And I think that relationship between restraint and expression that's at the heart of that photograph has been something that has really stayed with me. Yeah, so it was really amazing moment.
Also, it's an instantaneous impact. This just happens like that, There is that quality.
Yes, and yet you can keep looking at it.
Yeah.
So that's another thing I think that I have come to value so much, is the idea of like this kind of slow looking, making pieces that reward, speaking of time, right? So that Arbus photograph, as much as it has this instantaneous like impact, you can keep looking at it and keep looking at it.
Those are pictures that you can sit with for a long time.
Yeah, and return to. So I think I want for people looking at my photographs to have a kind of experience of being drawn in and kind of have a passage, their own passage through the piece. But I wanted to just mention something about time, because the work itself in its content, in its subject, has so much to do with these cycles of time. But even the way in which I'm making the woven pieces is a bit of a change in the kind of language of photography. So Fruitless and Fallen are made with my 4x5 view camera. Woven, I use a digital SLR. I make 30 to 50 frames. I think the piece in ICP was over 50 individual frames. and they're stitched together later in Photoshop. That's what enables me to, you know, have this killer resolution. But it also means that I'm no longer it's not one instant of time. The photograph is almost like a kind of collection of moments, and it changes how the thing looks. So when I first was trying to make the woven pieces, I just assumed I would just go to an even bigger camera, right? An 8x10 view camera. But it didn't work because it was like things in the center looked great, but then around the edges, not so much. And it helped me to recognize this thing that you've been talking about this kind of like particularity and attention and the tapestries, because I wanted something like kind of spread out and flat, where something in like one of the corners was kind of described with the same level of intensity and respect as an object in the center. So the a kind of visual democracy that's also in a, like, where again, that central figure is removed.
But there's a lot of work in achieving that behind the scenes.
Oh yeah, no, it's incredible. It's incredible.
Yeah.
But I guess, you know, just because you were so keen to ask about like the sense of time. So I think time is actually functioning very differently in the woven pieces, and in terms of the arc of that you were asking me about before, about Fruitless Fall and Woven.
Yes.
So much of the subject of all three series is about these cycles of growth and decay, but also about a shift in the language of the photograph. And how time is functioning in that way. So I just wanted to add that.
So how is it for you as a very active person who spend all day at ICP introducing yourself and your work to the visitors?
It's fine. It's nice. I mean, it's
fine.
Like we've all been like, you know, I'm in like either in the forest or I'm teaching, I'm doing things, but it's actually quite nice to communicate with like just these years of pandemic where there's been so much less just exchange of, you know, having a conversation with you, some of the other people who came, and these kind of more happenstance human connections. So for me, it's perfectly delightful to have just some human contact. No, that's not true. I have plenty of human contact, but you know what I mean.
Yes, yes.
It's been a strange time, to say the least.
Well, you were in a larger bubble, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so, you know, you describe yourself as being a very intense person. You train in boxing and martial arts, which was a surprise to me.
Surprise to me too. If I had to make like predictions about myself when I was like in my 20s,
yeah,
lots of things that are in my life now I would never ever have expected. First of all, I don't think I would have expected that I would be like really, really happily married. I certainly would never have expected that 3 or 4 times a week I train for a couple of hours, and I'm actually getting ready for my test for my second degree black belt in April. So this involves, it's a huge time commitment, but it's also a kind of like, it's a community, right? It's a community of people that are from very different. Do
you think it'll come to you in a few years from now as why you were doing what you're doing now with boxing and martial arts?
I mean, I feel like I have some sense of it. I know that kind of in a similar way that in Introduction to Photography, I felt a kind of drive to push myself. And it has to do with, they're related, because it has to do with concentration and focus, attention to detail, and
Focus,
put like
focus, yeah.
Focus. So when I go in there, there might be, you know, the most harrowing things happening in the political landscape, or even in my own personal life. And yet, if my mind wanders, I either sometimes I might just make a mistake, or I could get hit in the face, right? It's like, you really have to be paying attention.
You have to be there.
You have to be there. And that, I mean, that is amazing. Things that are demanding enough that they require you to be nowhere else but in the present 100%. Not checking your phone from time to time, not mind wandering, not doodling while watching, not, you know. So, and it also has been sort of amazing. I mean, I felt kind of like a little bit of a vulnerable, very sensitive kid. And it's been kind of incredible to feel and be physically powerful and to do things I could never, ever have dreamt that I could do. Am I the best at it? No. You know, I'm not. I know there are people who are like, they're more naturally gifted in how they use their bodies. They're more naturally coordinated. But for my own trajectory, I feel pretty, I don't know, just, I guess, sort of amazed that I can do this at all.
So tell us about the birthday club.
Oh, yeah. I love to talk about the birthday club. So one of the best things that came out of Yale was meeting these other women who are in the program. Marion Bellinger, who I shared a dark room with, Laura Latinsky, Mary Berridge, Ann Burke Daly, and Jeanette Williams. Anne was in the painting program, and she and I together were fellows, teaching fellows at the Yale Summer School in Norfolk, Connecticut. And that's when we sort of forged our friendship. And so this has been since 1988, 1989.
Long time.
We have been in this incredibly just rich dialogue about one another's work and our lives. So we're friends. During the pandemic, we started a weekly rotation of virtual studio visits, which kept us all like working and kind of grounded. We help each other edit books. There's kind of almost like a kind of co-mentorship.
That's very precious.
It's precious. It's absolutely amazing. We
Really
had we did have a tragedy where Jeanette Williams died several years ago. And that was, I think we didn't even know what we were after that happened, because, you know, 6 people, it's like a family, and you lose one and you don't, it's like we had to kind of
recalibrate.
Exactly. So I feel like that's been like one of the things that I guess I just feel just so lucky that I have that I've gotten to see into the process of, you know, doubt and then breakthroughs and all that with these other artists, and that they also will like look at my work and tell me honestly if something is really not working. Yeah. Or when they think it is and why. I mean, that's an incredible thing to have. Yeah.
I was very sorry to hear about your gallerist, Julie Saul, passing away. You told me about it. And it was sort of a bit of a shock for me, because she had such a nice presence in the studio, and she has a beautiful smile. She was always extremely welcoming, and the shows that she put up were always of high quality. So it's a sad thing. But the question that comes up also is, how did you manage to get your large pieces into that sort of smallish studio of hers?
Yeah.
On the 6th floor, I think it was, or the 5th floor. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that was actually not easy, but I want to, before I say anything about that, I do want to say that I think when we saw each other, she was quite ill, but hadn't yet passed away. And then I'm here, you know, hearing that she died, I think it's a weird thing how, even though it wasn't a surprise, it was really bracing to fathom, I think, not so much my personal loss, but I think so much of the loss within the art world and what she really contributed. Like, I was looking at shows of hers in the 80s at Lieberman and Saul. Like, she was a woman gallerist doing these incredible shows. And I think she, more than almost any other photography gallery, was at the forefront of a kind of openness about what photography is, you know, and she was showing not only photography, but other things also before it was like, you know, sort of a little more fashionable. So I want to just honor her with how much she gave, you know, to the field, and really made that.
It was an important gallery, yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, back to your question, it was actually a really big problem of the scale of the pieces, to the point where we wondered if I should try making them smaller, and I tried. I made them 4 inches smaller. If they were 4 inches smaller, they could fit in the elevator framed. And we looked at the 2 pieces side by side, and it just didn't work. I mean, it took me a really long time to come to this exact scale. Everything from making tests to putting blue tape of that exact scale. There was something about when it's 60 by 120 instead of 62 by 124, it just lost a little bit of magic.
Something happens.
Something happened. So we agreed that that wasn't an option. So we showed the prints unframed, which was a compromise. I don't regret the compromise, but it was a compromise. Like when I saw the show, seeing the show at ICP with the piece properly presented, which is how they were presented in the George Eastman show, is very important. It's not, they're not pieces where I want to draw attention to the physical object of the print. So when they're hanging as physical objects, they're, you know, there's a slight wave in the paper. They had to have white borders for the clips. And so it was a changed experience, which I personally felt, again, was a compromise. I was glad to have them up, but it underscores just how important every little decision is in terms of the viewer's experience, right? When you see the piece up at ICP, I think because it's, you know, perfectly flat, mounted onto Dibond, there's no glass in front of it, there's no white border. It's a way for the viewer to kind of enter into the photograph and the image and move across it with, and I think those other elements of the physical object of the print,
There's no question about that, yeah.
They're a little bit of a distraction.
Yeah.
So
who can be a collector that has that kind of stuff?
I know I'm a little bit of a problem, honestly. I mean, there are pieces I make that are smaller. Some of the woven pieces, if they work at 31 by 62, I do have an edition at 31 by 62. But I am idealistic. Like, I feel like they're difficult in certain ways to work with. But I do feel like the vision of how something should be realized physically has to be honored. And if that narrows the scope of collectors, I don't know, so be it. But although my new work, I'm printing directly onto Dibond. My light just went out. Oh well. And I don't know why. I guess I won't bother with it. And the surface is a little more durable. They're still the same giant scale, but a little, like, I think just like a little bit more practical than the bare print surface. I mean, collectors do usually put plexi in front of the print, you know, for protection. When museums collect them, they don't usually do that, but sometimes they do. But I mean, of course, again, just my ideal viewing situation is just to have the print without any obstruction of glass or plexi in front of it. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say about that. Part of me thinks that it would be better for the work to situate it a little bit outside of the photography world per se, just because there are collectors out there that are interested in large scale works or aren't afraid of them, but it's not necessarily like the photography world per se, but
there are corporate collectors who can accommodate that kind of size for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
So your exhibit will be there till May 22nd. And I really like people who have been listening to this interview to go and take a look. ICP is at 79 Essex Street. And it's worth the trip. And of course, once you're there, there's a lot more to see. But yes, go see it. And Tanya, thank you so much for.
Oh, thank you. It was really a pleasure to talk to you.
Same here.
I just want to say, like, the show, David Campany's shows, both shows,
yes, both shows
are truly brilliant. I mean, he's another one of those, like, he's a visionary in the field, I think. Yes, so yeah, seeing, you know, my pieces up, there's no substitute, there's like no JPEG will ever convey anything of, I think, what it's like to be in front of the thing. But I think both shows are extremely rewarding.
Yes. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
And
all right.
Yes.
Take care. Have a good day.
You too.
Okay, bye-bye.